I dialed my mother's number with trembling fingers, my heart racing as I rehearsed the words, "Mom, I'm coming home for Christmas." After years of distance, I imagined her crying with joy, Dad clapping in the background, Josh finally sounding proud. Instead, her voice sliced through the line. "This Christmas is only for special people, Natalie. You understand." In the background, I heard Josh's laughter and the squeals of his kids sharper than any blade. I froze beside the tiny tree in my Chicago apartment. But instead of crying, I opened the family group chat and sent 2 photos, a brand new house with a white fence and a sleek black SUV gleaming under showroom lights. My message was only 7 words. "Too bad you already missed it." Seconds later, my phone exploded with calls. "Hi everyone, I'm Natalie here. I grew up on the far end of Maple Street in Ohio in a weather-beaten house that always seemed to lean under the weight of silence. The walls smelled faintly of dust and fried oil, and the fence out front sagged like it was tired of holding anything up. Inside those walls, love was never evenly divided. My parents gave their softness, their smiles, their attention to my younger brother Josh. For me, the eldest daughter, they reserved a single word that became my lifelong sentence independent. Josh was born fragile, at least that's how the story was told. Hospital stays, pale skin, the constant fear that he might break. Mom hovered over him like he was made of glass. Dad called him the little fighter. And me, I was the strong one, the girl who didn't need help, didn't need hugs, didn't need anything. At least that's what they told themselves. In truth, I needed it all. I remember Christmases the most. Josh sat in the living room surrounded by boxes wrapped in glittery paper, ripping them open with squeals that filled the house. A Lego set a remote control car, a shiny new jacket that smelled of fresh fabric dye. I sat nearby holding a single gift. Sometimes it was a used book, sometimes a sweater with the tags already cut off. One year, Mom handed me a secondhand science encyclopedia with a note inside the cover, "Study hard, Natalie." I forced a smile, whispered thanks, and pretended the knot in my throat was just excitement. I wasn't jealous in the childish sense I didn't want his toys. What I wanted was the look in my parents' eyes when they watched him, the way their pride lit up like the tree in the corner. I wanted just once for them to look at me that way. School didn't make it better. When I came home with perfect grades, Dad would grunt and say, "That's what we expect from you." When Josh brought home a mediocre report card, Mom beamed. "He's trying so hard." The message was clear. My achievements were obligations. His mediocrity was a miracle. The only place I ever felt seen was at my grandparents' farm. Every summer they'd take me in, and their house smelled like sunflowers and baked apples. My grandmother Anne would bake pies and tell me stories of her youth, her eyes sparkling like she hadn't aged a day. My grandfather Clifford would pat my shoulder after a day in the fields and murmur, "You're a special girl, Natalie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words were like water in a desert. But deserts reclaim their ground. When I was 9, Grandpa died suddenly of a heart attack. I remember gripping Grandma's hand at the funeral, trying to stay strong. She whispered, "He was always proud of you." 4 years later, she followed him, and with her went the only steady warmth I'd ever known. After that, the world felt colder than the Ohio winters. As I grew older, I learned the art of invisibility. At 13, I started taking odd jobs delivering newspapers in the foggy mornings, stocking shelves at the grocery store after school. My hands always smelled of ink or bleach. I told myself this was normal, that being useful was better than being loved. I saved every dollar, not for fun, but for survival. Old textbooks, worn notebooks, shoes that didn't blister. I discovered coding almost by accident through a tattered book at a secondhand shop. It felt like discovering a secret language. I'd spend nights in the library, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead, teaching myself how to speak to machines because they didn't talk back with disappointment. The first time a line of code actually worked, I felt something electric, like maybe I could build a world where I finally mattered. But at home, nothing changed. Josh got new clothes, sports camps, piano lessons. I got hand-me-downs and silence. One Thanksgiving, I tried to tell Mom about a drawing competition I'd won. She nodded absently and then asked me to help Josh with his essay. The certificate ended up tucked into the bottom of a drawer, never mentioned again. By the time I reached college, I was used to scraping by. A partial scholarship covered tuition, but everything else came from long shifts at a coffee shop and late nights repairing computers. I lived on ramen and 4 hours of sleep, my fingers constantly sore from typing or scrubbing. When graduation came, I walked across the stage alone. My parents said they couldn't make it. They were busy taking Josh to a basketball tournament. I clutched my diploma with trembling hands, looking out at rows of families cheering for their children, and told myself the same lie I'd been telling for years. I don't need anyone. I can handle this alone. But deep inside, a quiet voice still asked, when will I be special too? Chicago didn't welcome me so much as tolerate me. The city's skyline looked like ambition carved into steel, but for me, it was just another place where I had to fight for air. My studio apartment was barely wider than my outstretched arms. The radiator coughed more than it worked, and the one window framed nothing but bricks. But in that shoebox of a room, I clung to the idea that I could build something bigger than my past. By day, I poured coffee for strangers who never learned my name. I worked in a noisy bar where Friday smelled like sweat and Sunday like bleach. At night, I hunched over a laptop whose keys were rubbed smooth, teaching myself to string together lines of code. My fingers were blistered from carrying trays, my eyes red from blue light, but somehow the exhaustion kept me alive. It was proof I hadn't given up. That's when Step Up was born. At first, it was just an idea scribbled on a napkin after a run in the park, an app that tracked small habits, steps, sleep, little victories that nobody else noticed. Maybe it was just me talking to myself, begging for a witness. Still, I coded late into the night, drinking cheap coffee and ignoring the hunger gnawing at my stomach. The first version was a disaster. The second one froze constantly. The third crashed before it even opened. But each failure made me more stubborn. One night, desperate to share a spark of hope, I called home. I told Dad I was building something that maybe it could change my life. He chuckled. Natalie, dreams don't pay rent. You need a real job. Be more like Josh, he just got promoted. My throat closed. Every word I'd saved for weeks burned away in that single moment. I muttered, "Okay, Dad," and hung up. But I didn't quit. I plastered flyers in coffee shops, begged friends to download the app, responded to every one-star review like it was gospel. Slowly, painfully, Step Up started to breathe. Then one night, an email came in. An actual company wanted to collaborate. A week later, another. I thought my chest might explode with relief. Months later, the unimaginable happened. A major corporation wanted to buy Step Up. The number made my knees weak, $560,000. I stared at the contract, the zeros swimming before my eyes. When I signed, the office windows glittered with the Chicago skyline, but I felt oddly hollow. I had money in the bank now, more than I could have dreamed of as a girl eating ramen in a damp dorm. Yet there was no one to call, no arms waiting to celebrate me. That was when the idea struck me. Maybe if I gave back to my family, they'd finally see me. I searched quietly for months until I founded a white-fenced home in Ohio, close to the town where I grew up. It was bright and spacious, with a yard perfect for retirement. I imagined Mom smiling in the sunlit kitchen, Dad reading the newspaper in a comfortable armchair, and for Josh, a sleek black SUV, the kind he'd always bragged about. I thought foolishly that these gifts would buy me more than gratitude. I thought they would buy me belonging. So that December, I called home for the first time in years with good news. My heart raced as the phone rang. I pictured Mom's voice breaking into tears, Dad finally saying he was proud Josh, admitting he'd underestimated me. But the moment Mom picked up the fantasy, shattered. Her voice was as flat and cold as an Ohio winter. "Oh, Natalie, we're not home. We're in Florida with Josh and his family. This holiday is only for special people, you understand. Special people." The words sliced through me. I pressed the phone to my ear, hearing Josh's laugh in the background, the children squealing. My chest constricted until I could barely breathe. I was their daughter, their eldest, and yet in their eyes, I was disposable. I whispered, "Right, I get it. Have fun," and hung up before my voice broke. Back in my apartment, the tiny Christmas tree blinked at me with cruel indifference. I sat at the table, opened the family group chat, and attached 2 photos, the Ohio house and the black SUV. My fingers trembled, but the message was sharp, carved straight from my bleeding heart. "Too bad you just missed your gift." I hit send. The phone lit up instantly, calls, texts, notifications stacking so fast I thought the screen might burst. "Natalie, call me back right now." "Honey, don't be dramatic." "Sis, is that house real?" I stared at it all, then pressed the mute button. Silence filled the room again, broken only by the wind rattling my window. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I wasn't begging for love. I was daring them to realize what they'd lost. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. The girl who'd spent 32 years waiting at the edge of the room had finally stood up. The phone buzzed all night, lighting up my tiny apartment like a siren I refused to answer. Each vibration rattled against the wooden table, but I left it face down. For 32 years, I had been the one to bend to pick up to explain myself. Not anymore. That night, silence was my shield, but silence didn't mean weakness. In the days that followed, I began to shape something different, a life that couldn't be hijacked by guilt or manipulation. The house in Ohio, the SUV for Josh, they weren't gone, but they would never be handed to them like trophies for bad behavior. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I'd make sure my existence was written into places they couldn't erase. I called my attorney, a woman I barely knew but trusted enough to guide me. Together, we transferred the deed of the Ohio house into a revocable trust. The trust included strict conditions. My parents could only live there if they maintained the property and if they never used it to take out loans or pawn it off for quick cash. And most importantly, I added one clause of my own: if they attempted to manipulate or publicly humiliate me again, the property reverted back to me instantly. It wasn't revenge, it was insurance. A quiet declaration that I would no longer be their afterthought. The SUV for Josh went into a short-term lease under his name with insurance tied to his own credit. If he wanted to drive that car, he had to prove he could be responsible. For once in his life, my brother would have to stand on his own 2 feet instead of being carried on my back. And then I did something that mattered more to me than either of those gifts. I opened a new account and funded it with a portion of my step-up money. I named it the Ann Foster Scholarship after my grandmother, the only person who had ever told me I was special. The scholarship was designed for girls like me, the daughters labeled independent, so their families could neglect them. Girls who were smart, overlooked, and in need of someone to believe in them. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce it to the world. I simply filed the papers, signed the documents, and felt something in my chest unclench. For once, my efforts weren't about buying my family's love. They were about breaking the cycle. When the paperwork was complete, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and opened an old sketchbook I'd hidden for years. Inside were faded pencil drawings of cornfields, portraits of my grandparents, half-finished sketches of houses I once dreamed of living in. I hadn't drawn since high school when Mom told me art won't put food on the table, Natalie. Be practical. I'd believed her and buried that part of myself. But that night, I sharpened a pencil and let my hand wander across the page. The lines were shaky, at first hesitant, like they'd been trapped too long. Then they steadied. The image of a small cottage by the ocean began to form under my hand waves, curling in the background, smoke rising from a tiny chimney. I didn't know it then, but I was sketching my future. The phone still buzzed from time to time, texts from Mom insisting I was overreacting. Dad saying it had all been a misunderstanding. Josh firing off a single line. "Seriously, sis, you're making a fool of yourself." I didn't answer. Not one word. For once, my silence wasn't submission. It was defiance. It was the sound of me reclaiming my life. Instead of waiting for their approval, I poured my energy into routines that belonged only to me. I ran along the frozen sidewalks, breath clouding the air. I practiced cooking meals that filled my apartment with warmth instead of emptiness. I played music while I coded, not to drown out the quiet, but to give it rhythm. And every time I passed my little Christmas tree, I no longer saw a symbol of loneliness. I saw a marker of survival. They thought ignoring me, excluding me, would break me. What they didn't know was that I was already rebuilding piece by piece in places they couldn't reach. The trust, the scholarship, the sketchbook, they weren't weapons. They were anchors. Quiet, steady anchors, reminding me I didn't need to beg for a place at their table. I was carving out my own. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their voices. I was listening to my own. At first, the silence felt like victory. My phone stopped vibrating, and for 2 days, the world outside my apartment went quiet. I thought maybe they had given up, that my message had finally sunk in. But people like my parents and my brother never walk away without one more performance. The flood returned on the third night. Mom sent the first message, "Natalie, you misunderstood me. I was just joking when I said special people." Of course you're special. A second one followed minutes later. "Call me. Please. We can work this out as a family." I stared at the glowing screen, my hands cold despite the radiator groaning behind me. The words were familiar, dressed in fake softness. My whole childhood had been threaded with these half-apologies. "You're strong, you'll be fine." They didn't want to make things right. They wanted me to erase what had happened, to reset the board so they could keep playing the same game. Dad was less subtle. His voicemail was sharp, every word clipped. "You're tearing this family apart, Natalie. Do you know how selfish this looks? You send pictures of a house and a car, then go silent. People will think you've lost your mind. Call me back and stop acting dramatic." Selfish, dramatic. Words I'd been branded with since I was old enough to form opinions. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the end. Josh chimed in next. His text was short, almost mocking, "Wow, sis, big shot in Chicago now. Guess money makes people lose their sense of humor." Then another "that SUV pic, was that for me, or just another stunt to make us look bad?" I laughed bitterly, the sound startling in the stillness of my apartment. Of course, even in this, Josh managed to twist it into something about him. He didn't ask how I was, didn't ask why I hadn't come home in years. All he saw was a shiny car, and the possibility that for once he might not be the favorite. The real blow came from my aunt, who lived a few blocks away from my parents. She sent a long message dripping with faux concern. "Sweetheart, your mom is heartbroken. She says you're cutting everyone off and refusing to be part of the family. You know they love you. Don't let pride ruin things. Blood is blood. Blood is blood." The phrase tasted like iron in my mouth. If blood had been enough, I wouldn't have spent my childhood eating sandwiches in my room while the rest of the family laughed over pizza. Blood didn't protect me from being invisible. Blood didn't sit in the bleachers at my graduation. Blood didn't love me, it demanded obedience. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I wrote in my journal late into the night, the pen scratching across the page like a declaration no one else would ever read. If love must be begged for, it is not love. If belonging requires erasing myself, it is not belonging. I refuse to play the shadow anymore. But ignoring them didn't stop their campaign. A coworker at the cafe where I used to pick up shifts pulled me aside one afternoon. "Hey, your mom reached out on Facebook. She posted about, you said you're going through a phase that you're isolating yourself. She asked people to pray for you." I felt heat rush to my face, not from shame, but from rage. A phase, 32 years of silence, neglect, and dismissal, reduced to a convenient narrative that made me look unstable, while they played the role of loving parents. They weren't apologizing. They were managing optics. Still, I stayed quiet. The pressure ramped up again before New Year's. A string of texts arrived from Dad, each more urgent than the last Natalie pickup. "We're trying to fix this. You can't just walk away from family. Do you want to be remembered as the daughter who abandoned us?" I stared at that last one for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, tempted to write back, "I was abandoned years ago. I'm just returning the favor." But I didn't. My silence was louder. Instead, I poured myself into the things that made me feel alive. I drew. I coded small projects. I ran by the lake, letting the icy wind slap my cheeks awake. Every time the phone buzzed, I let it buzz. Every missed call was a reminder I was no longer the obedient daughter, waiting for scraps of affection. They wanted a reaction, but all they got was stillness. And in that stillness, for the first time in my life, I felt power. Because power wasn't in yelling back. Power wasn't in sending long explanations. Power was in knowing I didn't owe them anything anymore. And the more they pushed, the more I realized my silence was rewriting the story they thought they'd written for me. The knock came on a gray afternoon in late January. Snow clung to the sidewalks in dirty patches, and the Chicago wind rattled my window panes like a warning. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I peered through the peephole, my stomach tightened. My parents stood in the hallway, bundled in heavy coats. Behind them was Josh, his hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting anywhere but the door. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. But something in me, something older, stronger, made me turn the knob. The three of them shuffled inside, their eyes sweeping over my small apartment. The chipped table, the sagging couch, the tiny Christmas tree I hadn't taken down yet, light still faintly glowing. It was worlds away from the suburban dream house I'd nearly handed them. Mom was the first to speak. Her voice wavered, practiced tremble stitched into every syllable. "Natalie, sweetheart. We didn't mean what we said. The special people comment it was just a joke. You know we didn't want to hurt you." Dad cleared his throat, straightening his shoulders like he was delivering a lecture. "We're proud of you. Always have been. But you blindsided us with those pictures. A house, a car. That's not how families communicate. You should have talked to us first." Josh leaned against the wall, arms crossed, mumbling, "Look, I didn't know you felt left out, okay? If I'd known, I wouldn't have." He trailed off, eyes sliding toward the floor. Their words fell over me like a familiar script. Apologies that weren't apologies. Pride spoken like a punishment. Excuses without accountability. For a flicker of a second, I almost let myself believe them. I almost stepped back into the role I had always played, the daughter who swallowed her hurt and pretended it was fine. But then I saw where their eyes lingered, not on me, not on the life I had built, but on the manila folder resting on my table. The one that contained the trust documents, the scholarship paperwork, the deeds. Their gaze gave them away. They hadn't come for me. They'd come for the gifts. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the silence that had become my strength. "I've waited 32 years," I said evenly, "for you to see me, to love me without conditions, and you never did." Mom's face twitched. "That's not fair." I raised a hand, stopping her. My voice didn't shake. "I'm not here to argue about fairness. I'm here to tell you that I'm done begging. The house, the car, those weren't bribes. They were my last attempt to show you who I've become. But I see now, no matter what I give it, will never be enough." Dad's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but I slid the manila folder toward them before he could speak. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. Josh frowned. "The house papers." I shook my head and pulled out a single sheet tucked carefully inside. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting neat but fragile. "This," I said softly, "is a note Grandma Ann left with her will. It wasn't about money. It was about me." I unfolded it and read aloud, my throat tightening, but my voice steady. "To my granddaughter, Natalie, who carries strength like fire, never forget you were always my pride. You were never invisible to me." The words filled the room, heavier than any accusation I could have hurled. My mother's eyes darted away. My father shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. Josh muttered something under his breath I couldn't catch. I folded the note carefully and placed it back into the folder. Then I looked at them, really looked, and realized I no longer needed their validation. My grandmother's words had echoed through decades to reach me exactly when I needed them most. I walked to the door and opened it wide. "Thank you for coming," I said quietly. But I think this is where our conversation ends. They hesitated. For a moment, I thought Mom might cry, that Dad might protest, that Josh might plead, but none of them did. They shuffled out into the hallway, their silence louder than their excuses. When the door clicked shut, I leaned against it, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 32 years. The apartment was empty again, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt lighter. I turned to the little Christmas tree still glowing faintly in the corner. I picked up the folded note from Grandma Ann and held it to my chest. For the first time, I felt a strange, steady peace. Because I finally understood I had been special all along. I just needed to believe it myself. After that day, the apartment didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a launch pad. For the first time, I wasn't staying because I had nowhere else to go. I was staying until I chose what came next. And what came next was freedom. I left Chicago in the spring, packing only what mattered: my grandmother's note, my sketchbooks, my guitar, and the laptop that had carried me through sleepless nights. I drove west until the air turned salty and the horizon opened into ocean. In Oregon, I found a cottage by the shore, small, wooden, a little crooked but perfect. Every morning the waves greeted me like an old friend, and every night the tide sang me to sleep. Here I gave myself permission to live. I signed up for a community art class and let the smell of paint and turpentine fill my lungs. My first canvas was clumsy, streaked with uneven color, but I smiled anyway. I wasn't painting for approval. I was painting for me. I bought a secondhand guitar, sat on the porch at sunset, and let my fingers stumble through chords until music finally found me. I joined a volunteer group building playgrounds for kids who didn't have one. When a little girl ran up, hugged my leg, and whispered, "Thank you," something inside me healed in ways no apology ever could. I also used part of my step-up money to grow the Ann Foster Scholarship. Letters began arriving from young women who'd been told they were too strong to need help. Their words reminded me of who I once was and of how far I'd come. That December, I decorated my seaside cottage with a bigger tree, hung ornaments in every color, and invited new friends over for dinner. There was laughter, music, and warmth in every corner. When they left, I stood on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the moonlight ripple across the waves. I pressed Grandma's note against my heart and whispered, "Sometimes family isn't blood. Sometimes family is the life you build, the love you choose, and the peace you finally allow yourself to feel." Have you ever had to walk away from people who never saw your worth? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if Natalie's journey resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories of strength, survival, and self-discovery.